The air in the house always seemed different when he was gone, quieter, heavier, as though the walls themselves felt the shift. The nights stretched longer, shadows growing thicker in the absence of his presence. It was during these times that everything seemed to unravel, as if the structure of their lives could only hold so long before the seams began to fray. She had grown accustomed to his absences, the late-night meetings, the out-of-town conferences that seemed to steal him away more often than not. At first, they had felt like a reprieve, a chance to breathe without the constant weight of expectations. But over time, those silences had transformed, turning the space between them into something colder, harder to bridge. It wasn't loneliness exactly, not at first. It was something more subtle, a quiet longing that crept in unnoticed until it could no longer be ignored. Her stepson, Ethan, had always been there, a fixture in their home, quiet, composed, his presence unassuming but constant. He had returned from college that summer, his demeanor more reserved than ever, as though he carried a burden he refused to share. She had noticed the way he moved through the house, his footsteps almost soundless, his gaze avoiding hers more often than not. It wasn't intentional, she thought, but rather a symptom of the distance that had grown between all of them over the years. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, she found herself alone in the living room. The soft hum of the television filled the silence, but her attention was elsewhere. She traced the rim of her wineglass with a finger, her thoughts scattered and unfocused. The air felt heavy, charged with something she couldn't quite name, and it was then that she noticed Ethan standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. There was something different about him that night, a quiet intensity in the way he looked at her, as though he were seeing her for the first time. She felt her pulse quicken, a sudden awareness of his presence that caught her off guard. It wasn't just the way he looked at her. It was the way the air seemed to shift, the space between them growing smaller despite the distance that separated them. She turned away, focusing on the flickering screen, but she couldn't shake the weight of his gaze. Over the following days, she found herself noticing him more often. The way he moved, the way his expression softened when he thought no one was watching. She told herself it was nothing, a fleeting curiosity born out of the stagnant rhythm of her life. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. There was a tension building, subtle but undeniable, and it scared her as much as it thrilled her. The house became a labyrinth of stolen glances and quiet moments that lingered too long. She would catch him watching her from across the room, his gaze intense but unreadable, and something in her chest would tighten. She began to dread and anticipate those moments in equal measure, the way they made her feel both exposed and alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, as the summer heat pressed against the windows, she stood in the kitchen, the sound of running water masking the silence. She didn't hear him enter, but she felt his presence before she saw him. He stood close, closer than he had any reason to, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. She could feel the warmth of him, the quiet hum of his energy filling the space between them, and she froze, unsure of what to do or say. His hand brushed against hers as he reached for a glass, the contact brief but electric, sending a jolt through her that left her breathless. She pulled away quickly, her mind racing, but the moment lingered, the air between them charged with something unspoken. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the sound of it loud in her ears as she turned away, gripping the counter to steady herself. The days that followed were a blur of tension and confusion. She avoided him as much as she could, but it seemed the more she tried to create distance, the closer he came. She felt trapped, caught in a web of her own making, and yet she couldn't bring herself to sever the thread that connected them. There was something intoxicating about the way he looked at her, the quiet intensity of his presence, and she found herself drawn to him despite everything. One evening, as the sun set and the shadows grew long, she found herself in the study, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm light across the room. She had been thumbing through an old book, the words blurring on the page as her thoughts drifted elsewhere. The sound of the door opening pulled her from her reverie, and she looked up to see him standing there, his expression unreadable. He stepped inside, his movements deliberate but unhurried, and the air seemed to shift, growing heavier with each step he took. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze meeting hers, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The silence stretched, thick and charged, and she felt her breath catch in her throat. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. The look in his eyes said everything, and she felt the ground beneath her shift, unsteady and uncertain. The moment passed, and he turned, leaving the room as quietly as he had entered. She sat there for a long time. The memory of his gaze burned into her mind, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear, longing, and something she couldn't quite name. She knew she was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that could destroy everything if she wasn't careful. But as the silence of the house closed in around her, she realized she wasn't sure she wanted to step back. The days grew hotter as the summer wore on, and the house seemed to trap the heat, making every corner feel stifling. The atmosphere inside felt equally charged, as though the very air carried the weight of unspoken tension. She tried to keep herself busy, moving from room to room, tending to small tasks that didn't need doing. But no matter where she went, she could feel his presence, not always near, but always there, lingering in the edges of her awareness. That afternoon, the silence in the house felt oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the ceiling fan in the living room. She had been folding laundry in the master bedroom, her movements brisk and methodical, but her mind elsewhere. The door was ajar, and out of the corner of her eye, she noticed him pass by, his shadow briefly crossing the threshold before disappearing down the hall. Her hands faltered, the fabric slipping from her grasp as her breath hitched. She waited, expecting him to continue on, but instead, his footsteps stopped just beyond the doorway. She turned slightly, her pulse quickening as she saw him standing there, leaning casually against the frame. His gaze wasn't directed at her, not overtly, but she felt it all the same, like a slow burn crawling up her spine. The room seemed smaller with him there, the air heavier, and she found herself frozen in place, the laundry forgotten in her hands. He lingered for a moment longer before moving on, his retreating footsteps echoing faintly in the hallway. She exhaled, unaware she had been holding her breath. The pool had always been her escape, a place where she could shed the weight of the house and let herself drift, suspended in the cool, clear water. That evening, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, she slipped into the pool, the water enveloping her like a second skin. The stillness of the surface mirrored the quiet turmoil within her, the ripples spreading outward as she floated on her back, staring up at the fading light. She didn't hear him approach, but when she turned her head, she saw him sitting at the edge of the pool, his legs dangling in the water. He hadn't joined her in the pool before, always keeping his distance, but tonight was different. The sight of him there, so close yet so untouchable, sent a jolt through her, and she quickly turned away, her movements sending small waves lapping against the tiled edges. She climbed out of the pool, the cool evening air raising goosebumps on her skin. As she reached for her towel, she felt his gaze follow her, an almost tangible presence that made her movements slower, more deliberate. She wrapped the towel around herself, the fabric clinging to her damp skin, and walked past him without a word, her heart pounding as she disappeared into the house. Later that night, she found herself in the kitchen, unable to sleep. The dim light above the stove cast long shadows across the counters as she stood there, a glass of water in hand. The quiet was thick, the stillness of the house almost suffocating. When she turned, she nearly dropped the glass. He was there, standing in the doorway, his presence filling the space like a storm about to break. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, and the tension in the room grew palpable. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the closeness of his body sending her nerves into overdrive. He reached past her, his arm brushing hers as he grabbed a glass from the counter. The contact was brief but electric, leaving her breathless as he poured himself water and took a slow sip. She turned away, gripping the edge of the counter to steady herself, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel him behind her, the weight of his presence almost unbearable, but when she finally turned to face him, he was already walking away, the glass in his hand catching the faint light as he disappeared down the hall. The next morning, she woke early, the events of the previous night still fresh in her mind. She told herself to push it aside, to bury it beneath the layers of routine and obligation, but it refused to fade. As she moved through the house, she found herself hyper-aware of his every movement, every sound, every fleeting glance. The tension between them was no longer subtle. It had become a constant hum, vibrating just beneath the surface of their carefully constructed facade. That afternoon, she found herself in the study, the quiet of the room offering a temporary reprieve from the chaos in her mind. The door was closed, but she heard the faint sound of footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. Her heart raced as the knob turned, and he stepped inside, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. He moved closer, his steps measured, and she felt the room shrink around them. The space between them dissolved, and, for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The air was thick, heavy with unspoken words and unresolved tension, and she felt herself drawn to him despite the voice in her head screaming to stop. He reached out, his hand brushing hers, and the contact sent a shiver through her, leaving her rooted in place, unable to pull away. The intensity between them continued to build, threading its way through every corner of the house. Each moment felt heavier, charged with a current that neither of them dared to acknowledge. She tried to focus on routine, on the familiar rhythms of her days, but everything had taken on a different texture. The air felt thicker, the walls seemed closer, and every shared glance brought a quiet fire she couldn't extinguish. It was late one evening when the next line was crossed. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that only comes when everyone else has gone to bed. She had retreated to the den, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the room as she curled up on the couch with a book she couldn't focus on. The words blurred on the page, her thoughts drifting to the weight of his presence in the house, the way he seemed to inhabit every room, every thought. She didn't hear him approach this time. The first sign of his presence was the subtle dip of the couch as he sat beside her. The movement so quiet she might not have noticed if her senses weren't already heightened. Her breath caught as she turned to find him there, his expression unreadable, but his proximity undeniable. He was close, too close, and the quiet between them grew heavier with every second that passed. She stayed still, her body tense, as he reached for the book in her lap, his fingers brushing hers as he took it. The contact was fleeting, but enough to send her pulse racing. He flipped through the pages idly, his movements slow and deliberate, as though testing the boundaries of the space they now occupied. The air was thick with unspoken tension, and she felt as though she might drown in it. When he set the book aside, his gaze met hers, and the look in his eyes made her stomach twist. It wasn't just the intensity, it was the way he seemed to see her, really see her, in a way that made her feel exposed. Her mind screamed for her to stand, to leave, to break whatever spell had woven itself around them. But her body betrayed her, keeping her rooted in place as he leaned closer, the warmth of him brushing against her skin. Her heart pounded as his hand moved to rest on the back of the couch, just beside her shoulder. The movement was subtle, almost casual, but the intent behind it was anything but. She could feel the heat radiating off him, the closeness of his body a constant reminder of the line they were about to cross. She should have stopped it then, should have said something, done something, but the words wouldn't come. The air between them was electric, and she was powerless to do anything but let it pull her in. His fingers brushed against her shoulder, the contact light, but enough to set her nerves alight. He didn't move further, didn't push, but the quiet intensity of the moment left her breathless. Her mind raced, a chaotic swirl of thoughts and emotions she couldn't untangle. She felt trapped, caught between the undeniable pull of his presence and the voice in her head screaming at her to stop. When he finally pulled back, the spell was broken, but the aftermath lingered. The air in the room felt heavier, as though it had absorbed the tension between them. He stood, his movements slow and deliberate, and left without a word, leaving her alone with the memory of his touch and the echo of what they had almost done. She sat there for a long time, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear, desire, and something she couldn't quite name. The next morning, the house felt different. The silence was no longer a comfort, but a constant reminder of what had passed between them. She avoided him as much as she could, throwing herself into the mundane tasks of the day in an effort to push the thoughts from her mind. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the memory of the way he had looked at her, the quiet intensity of his presence. That afternoon, she retreated to the garden, hoping the fresh air might clear her head. The sun was warm on her skin, the scent of blooming flowers filling the air. She wandered through the rows of roses and lavender, her fingers trailing over the petals as she tried to lose herself in the moment. But even there, she couldn't escape the weight of him, the way he seemed to linger in every corner of her thoughts. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of his footsteps on the gravel path sending a jolt through her. She turned to find him standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. The garden suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier, as he took a step closer. She froze, her breath hitching as he closed the distance between them, the intensity in his eyes, making her pulse race. He didn't touch her this time, didn't say a word, but the weight of his presence was enough to leave her trembling. The silence stretched between them, thick and unyielding, and she felt as though she might collapse under the weight of it. When he finally turned and walked away, she was left standing there, her heart pounding and her mind racing. The line between them was growing thinner, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could resist crossing it. The tension in the house had reached its peak. It was as though every interaction, every shared space, carried an invisible thread tying them closer together, pulling tighter with each passing moment. She could no longer pretend that the electricity she felt whenever he was near was accidental. It was deliberate, undeniable, and growing stronger with each fleeting glance and hesitant touch. Late one evening, the house was cloaked in darkness except for the faint glow of light from the study. She had gone there to escape, to try and find solace in the quiet hum of the night, but instead, she found herself pacing. The room, usually a place of calm, now felt too small, too suffocating. Her mind raced, replaying every moment, every stolen second that had passed between them, and she felt the weight of it pressing down on her. She didn't hear him enter, but she felt his presence immediately. The air shifted, charged with the same energy that seemed to follow them wherever they went. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the faint light spilling from the hallway. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held the same intensity that had haunted her for weeks. He stepped inside, his movements slow and deliberate, and the door clicked shut behind him. The sound echoed in the quiet, sending a shiver down her spine. She stayed rooted in place, her heart pounding as he crossed the room. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him, close enough that she couldn't ignore the pull that seemed to draw them together. The silence between them was heavy, almost unbearable. He didn't speak, didn't reach for her, but the weight of his presence was overwhelming. She felt her resolve waver, her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble under the force of his gaze. Her breath hitched as he took another step closer, the distance between them dissolving until there was nothing left but the unspoken tension that had been building for so long. His hand moved slowly, brushing against hers, and the contact sent a jolt through her, leaving her breathless. She didn't pull away, couldn't bring herself to move as his fingers lingered, tracing a path up her arm. Her skin burned under his touch, every nerve ending alive with sensation, and she felt herself leaning into him despite the voice in her head screaming at her to stop. When his hand cupped her face, she closed her eyes, unable to fight the tidal wave of emotions crashing over her. The warmth of his palm, the steadiness of his touch, grounded her even as it unraveled her. Time seemed to slow, the world outside fading into nothingness as the space between them disappeared entirely. The night stretched on, and the boundaries they had once clung to dissolved entirely. Every stolen glance, every fleeting touch, had led to this moment, and there was no going back. She didn't think about what it meant, about what would come next. All that mattered was the here and now, the undeniable connection that had drawn them together despite everything. When the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, she sat alone in the study, the room bathed in a soft, golden glow. He was gone, having slipped away in the early hours, leaving her to face the weight of their actions alone. She traced her fingers over the armrest of the chair, her thoughts a chaotic mess of regret, longing, and something she couldn't quite name. The house felt different that morning, as though it had shifted to accommodate the new reality they had created. She moved through the rooms in a daze, her mind replaying every moment, every detail, with startling clarity. The memory of his touch lingered on her skin, a constant reminder of the line they had crossed. She found herself in the garden as the sun climbed higher in the sky, the warmth of the day doing little to ease the chill that had settled over her. The flowers seemed brighter, their colors more vivid, but even their beauty couldn't distract her from the storm raging inside. She sank onto the bench beneath the old oak tree, her hands trembling as she buried her face in them. The world around her carried on, oblivious to the shift that had taken place. The birds sang, the wind whispered through the trees, and the sun continued its steady ascent, but she felt as though she were standing still, trapped in the aftermath of a moment that had changed everything. And though she didn't know what would come next, she knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed passed in a blur of silence and unspoken tension. The house, once a sanctuary of routine and familiarity, now felt heavy with the weight of what had transpired. Every room carried echoes of that night, each glance a reminder of the line they had crossed. She moved through her days with a sense of detachment, her thoughts consumed by the memory of his touch, the intensity of his gaze, the undeniable connection that had shattered the fragile balance they had maintained. He had kept his distance since that night, his presence a constant hum in the background but never close enough to confront. It was as though they were both waiting, caught in a liminal space where neither could move forward nor retreat. She avoided the places where she knew he lingered, the quiet corners of the house where the tension between them had once sparked like fire. But no matter how far she tried to run, she couldn't escape the memory of him. The way he had looked at her, the way he had made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house in long shadows, she found herself standing in the doorway of the study once again. The room was quiet, the faint glow of the setting sun filtering through the curtains, and for a moment, she hesitated. She stepped inside, her movements slow and deliberate, and sank into the chair by the window. The weight of the past days pressed down on her, suffocating in its intensity. She closed her eyes, letting the silence wash over her, but it was short-lived. She heard him before she saw him, the soft sound of his footsteps on the hardwood floor. Her pulse quickened, her breath catching in her throat as he appeared in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the fading light. He didn't speak, didn't move, but the intensity of his presence filled the room, making the air feel heavy and charged. He stepped inside, his movements measured, and closed the door behind him. The sound echoed in the quiet, a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. He crossed the room slowly, each step deliberate, until he stood before her. She couldn't bring herself to look at him, her gaze fixed on the floor, but she felt his eyes on her, their weight impossible to ignore. The silence stretched, thick and unyielding, before he knelt in front of her. The movement was unexpected, and her breath hitched as she felt his hand rest gently on hers. The contact was light, almost tentative, but it sent a wave of emotion crashing over her. She finally looked up, meeting his gaze, and what she saw there left her breathless. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only the same intensity that had drawn them together time and time again. She didn't know who moved first, didn't know if it was him or her, but the space between them disappeared, the quiet tension that had defined their relationship giving way to something deeper, something more. The boundaries they had tried so hard to maintain were gone, dissolved into the air between them, and all that remained was the undeniable pull that had brought them to this moment. When it was over, the room was bathed in darkness, the last remnants of daylight fading into the night. He had left without a word, slipping away into the quiet of the house, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She sat there for a long time, the memory of his touch still lingering on her skin, the weight of their actions pressing down on her chest. The days that followed were a delicate balance of avoidance and quiet understanding. They didn't speak of what had happened, didn't acknowledge the shift in their relationship, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of what they had shared, the quiet understanding that neither of them could put into words. Eventually he left. It was inevitable, she supposed. The summer was coming to an end, and with it, the fragile bubble they had created would burst. He packed his things with little fanfare, his movements careful and deliberate, and when the day came for him to leave, he didn't linger. She watched from the doorway as he loaded his bags into the car, her heart heavy with the knowledge that this was the end. As he turned to face her, their eyes met one last time, and in that moment, everything that had been left unsaid passed between them. There were no words, no promises, only the quiet understanding that what they had shared would remain with them, a part of who they were. He nodded once, a silent farewell, and then he was gone, the sound of the engine fading into the distance as he drove away. The house felt impossibly quiet in his absence, the echoes of his presence lingering in every room. She moved through the days with a sense of detachment, her thoughts consumed by the memory of him. The weight of their actions hung heavy over her, but she couldn't bring herself to regret it. What they had shared, as complicated and forbidden as it was, had awakened something within her that she hadn't even realized was missing. In the months that followed, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. The house settled back into its familiar rhythms, and the memories of that summer became something she carried with her, tucked away in the quiet corners of her mind. But no matter how much time passed, she knew she would never forget the way he had made her feel, the way he had changed her in ways she couldn't explain. And though the world around her remained unchanged, she knew she would never be the same again.